Cubans mark the 70th anniversary of the Moncada army barracks attacks that led to the Cuban Revolution. How did the revolution change Cuba, and what are the challenges ahead? Hello, I'm Arland Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Cuban people are marking National Rebellion Day on Wednesday, recalling the armed attacks 70 years ago against army strongholds in eastern Cuba. A group of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro tried to overthrow the government of President Fulgencio Batista. That armed action became the spark for the Cuban Revolution. CGTN's Yves Engler has the story.
Cuba's National Rebellion Day on July 26 is an annual celebration which marks the anniversary of the 1953 attack on the Moncada army barracks in Santiago de Cuba led by Fidel Castro, igniting the Cuban Revolution. The aim was to oust Cuban President Fulgencio Batista, who came into power after a military coup in 1952. The action ended with the killing of many young revolutionaries and the imprisonment of others, including Fidel Castro. While on trial for the rebel attack on the Moncada barracks, Castro defended himself in a court in a speech entitled "History Will Absolve Me," which, according to researcher and journalist Victor Pérez Galdós, was later considered a political program for Cuba.
Fidel Castro exposed the country's major problems: huge unemployment, illiteracy, and homelessness, all addressed in a social program implemented after 1959 through national land and housing reforms, access to free education and health care, among other social transformations.
After their release from prison in 1955, Fidel Castro and his followers went to Mexico to organize the July 26 movement and returned to wage a guerrilla war which ousted President Fulgencio Batista in 1959. In a speech upon arriving in Havana in January 1959, Fidel Castro alerted the people that although the victory had been achieved, the future would still bring more difficult challenges. Researcher Pérez Galdós recalls some events related to Fidel Castro's prediction.
Just shortly after that, internal counter-revolutionary actions took place, along with discrediting campaigns and U.S. economic sanctions, followed by the 1961 Bay of Pigs armed invasion, and then the U.S. economic blockade and other U.S. restrictions still affecting Cuba's everyday life.
The annual July 26 celebrations, usually attended by leaders and activists from around the world, underscore the hard work of the Cuban people through the years, amidst successes, hardships, and foreign hurdles. The Moncada barracks and all other military garrisons during President Batista's time in office were turned into schools after 1959 as part of Cuba's emergent universal and free public education system. Luis Chirino, CGTN, Havana.
There's a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. From Havana, Carlos Alzugaray is a former Cuban diplomat and an educator. Also from Cuba, from the Escambray Mountains, Rafael Hernandez is the editor of Temas, a leading Cuban magazine. Here in Washington, D.C., Philip Brenner is Professor Emeritus at the School of International Service at American University. And Yves Engler is an activist and author. He joins us from Montreal in Canada. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Carlos Alzugaray, the Cuban Revolution began 70 years ago, but Fidel Castro only assumed power 6 years later in 1959. Take us back to that time. What were conditions like in Cuba at that time? And in the initial stages, what did the revolution change?
Okay, you have to understand that in 1959, 1952, Colonel Batista had assumed power again as a non-elected official. We had elections in 1940, 1944, 1948, and then the elections of 1952 were canceled by Batista's coup d'etat. So first, we had a military dictatorship ruling Cuba. Secondly, there was an accumulation of problems. One big problem was inequalities, poverty, racial discrimination, corruption, which was big, especially after the mafia got into Cuba. So the country was a mess and needed change. Change that almost everyone agreed that had to start first with agrarian reform, a land reform program, that had to be some cleaning up of the government, elimination of corruption, elimination of some of the worst part of the system, which was lack of public health, lack of real education. So there were a number of issues that really had to be solved. And one perspective was that, and one perspective that was very common at the time, because it had proven seriously, is that every time that Cuba had started changing things, the United States had intervened and stopped change. It's obviously that the regime that existed in Cuba from 1902 till 1959 was a regime that was controlled by Washington through their embassy in Havana and through their agents in Cuba, one of them, of course, Fulgencio Batista, the dictatorship. So the overthrow of the dictatorship entailed, for all intents and purposes, a fundamental change, economic, social, political, and the revolution began to change those things. It has to be taken into account that the first year of the revolution, there was the land reform, health reform. Second year, there was the educational reform, urban reform. So a number of reforms were put in place. But one of the most important things was the elimination of corruption and the expulsion of the mafia from Cuba.
Okay, let me go to Philip Brenner. Philip, of course, the United States imposed an embargo, a very tough embargo on Cuba, and there have been successive rounds of sanctions, very harsh sanctions that has been imposed on the country. But if we look at the achievements of the past 70 years, I mean, if we look at some of them and how they affect the Cuban people, Cuba has a healthcare system that is, by most accounts, better than the one in the United States. It has similar life expectancy to the United States. It has a lower infant mortality rate. It has a high literacy rate. Women are educated in impressive numbers, and there's a very high number of women who are represented in the country's legislature. I mean, despite the embargo, despite all these sanctions, how did Cuba manage to achieve that?
Well, first of all, some of those achievements are being eroded as we speak. And that is largely because of U.S. sanctions that continue to be very harsh, the harshest in the world. And so there's even sanctions against the purchase of food and medicines. Although Cuba can buy some, they have to buy it in cash and under very arduous conditions. And so you have to realize that even at this, today, as we talk, that embargo, or as Cubans call it, a blockade, is still affecting the daily life of Cubans. How they were able to do it is by having a sense of mission. I mean, Cubans truly believe that they were destined by history, in many ways, to rise up and be independent. Independence had been the call word for Cubans, not just since 1953, but actually since 1868. So the Cuban Revolution really is thought of as starting in 1868, when there was an effort to free Cuba from Spanish colonialism. And the Cuban Revolution continued with that sentiment that it wanted to be a free country. I think that gave people hope, and it gave people a sense of mission.
Rafael Hernandez, Cuba, of course, was hard hit by the COVID pandemic. There was also a tightening of the United States embargo. Then there was Hurricane Ian, which did about $1 billion worth of damage to Cuba. Now, at a ceremony to mark the 70th anniversary, President Miguel Diaz-Canel, he talked at that, and this is what he had to say. Let's listen to him.
The severity of the economic blockade and the current prevalence of the reinforcement measures established by the Donald Trump administration and maintained by the Biden administration, whose effect has elevated the policy of economic coercion, has made the blockade escalate to a qualitatively more aggressive and harmful dimension.
So, Rafael, clearly the country faces some tough challenges ahead, but the country's top economic planning minister, who's also the deputy prime minister, Alejandro Gil, he says Cuba can get back to 6% GDP growth, which it last had in 2019. And that is going to be a challenge because in one of its key sectors, the tourism sector, that's not got back on track to pre-pandemic levels. What is your assessment?
Well, it is very difficult to realize how much Cuba could do because we are exactly in the middle of a transition process. And the main challenge is how the state sector and the private sector, how the cooperative sector, how the different areas of independent labor, of non-state labor, as we call it here in Cuba, the non-state sector, how do the state sector and the non-state sector get articulated? I think that this is the main challenge. Today, there's more people working, like more workers, in the private enterprises than in state enterprises, comparatively speaking. The state is larger still in terms of labor force, but in terms of productivity, in terms of driving force, I think that today, if we add the small peasants, the small agricultural workers, the cooperativists, if we add the new private sector, if we add the self-employed workers, who are like 500,000, we have a huge force, economic force, social force, and also political force to make changes. So I think that the Minister of the Economy may be right as long as all those sectors can get articulated and put together in terms of looking for a coherent and a basic alliance around economic growth.
Yves Engler, of course, overshadowing everything that Cuba is trying to do is its very huge, rich and powerful northern neighbor, the United States. But there appears to be some kind of recognition in the United States that something needs to change. Recently, there were some Democrats in the United States Congress who were urging President Biden to reverse sanctions, not only on Cuba, but also in Venezuela. But one of the top Democrats in the Senate, Bob Menendez, who heads the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, he's a hardline right-wing extremist when it comes to Cuba. And he says the problems that those countries have, Cuba and Venezuela, are problems of their own making. It hasn't been caused by the embargo or sanctions of any kind. I mean, what are we to make of the fact that 70 years later, the United States still, to a large extent, adopts a Cold War mentality when it comes to Cuba?
Well, I wouldn't call it a Cold War mentality. I would call it a mentality of empire, or the mentality of a mafia don, that a shop that's not paying its racket money is not following the orders of the mafia don. We're going to punish that shop. We're going to bust it up. In this case, we're going to sanction. We're going to try to isolate a country to make an example of that country to the rest of the world, to say that we rule the world and we are going to dominate. I think that that's what there's lots of economic reasons. American exporters that have interests in greater exports to Cuba. There are economic reasons or corporate interests in the U.S. that would benefit from lessening of the embargo and all the sanctions. But the U.S. does this because Cuba is not following orders. Cuba has been an example of resistance, particularly socialistic resistance, transformation that many countries in the hemisphere, of course, are very unequal countries, and therefore those types of transformations would be a positive development. And the U.S. is 70 years later, continuing with this this sort of brutal response to Cubans' sovereignty and their decision making.
Of course, there is an element of Cold War in this, because as a result of the U.S. sanctions, Cuba has had to turn even more to China, to Russia, even Iran for support to simply buy things like oil. And China has provided significant assistance to Cuba. And as the United States thinks of China and Russia as new enemies in a kind of new Cold War, Cuba's association with them makes it more of a Cold War, new Cold War dilemma for improving relations.
Philip, there was that effort by President Obama to normalize relations, to improve ties with Cuba. But of course, then President Trump came to office and he undid most of that. And then, of course, President Biden comes to office and he has largely kept in place those actions that were taken by his predecessor, President Trump. I mean, why have we not seen more of an effort from the Biden administration? Of course, he was vice president in the administration that tried to improve ties.
In fact, on the campaign trail in 2020, he promised that he would return U.S. relations to the Obama period, but he has violated his own promises. And there are several reasons for that. One is that there is no one in the administration who actually supported those changes. His assistants, the people who make policy in the White House and in the State Department, haven't been strongly in favor of opening up. Second is Senator Menendez, as was mentioned. He's a very important figure, and with only one vote in the Democrats' favor in the Senate, you need every vote that you can get. And so he holds a lot of power. And President Biden used to be a senator and listens to the people in the Senate. And so there are domestic politics, there's institutional politics, and President Biden himself thinks in Cold War terms, and that's a real problem.
Rafael, the embargo remains in place, but what of Cuba's relations with its neighbors in the Caribbean, in South America for that matter, and as Philip pointed out, its relationship with major powers in the world, like China? It's also trying to become a member of BRICS right now.
I think that right now we are in a period in which Cuban relations, Cuban ties with the hemisphere, Latin America, the Caribbean, Canada, are closer than ever before. We have good relations, very good relations with some countries like Mexico, some countries like Venezuela, like Colombia, like Ecuador. I would say that we have very good relations with Brazil. We have very good relations with Argentina. We have very good relations with Chile. And we have relations that could be considered fair, relations that are positive with the rest of the hemisphere. In the case of the Caribbean countries, the Cuban medical cooperation, Cuban assistance in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of sport training, are also an important, a substantial part of relations, of bilateral relations with the Caribbean and with every Caribbean country. We have relations with countries where Cuba, during the Cold War, had zero relations, like the case of El Salvador, the case of Haiti, the case of the Dominican Republic. Now we are closer than ever. As I said, the question is how much that articulation, that good relationship becomes part of Cuban development. That how much that potential in terms of Cuban skilled labor force, of Cuban high scientific and technical development, vaccines, biotechnology production, all that can be a central part in Cuban cooperation services, like that in Cuban cooperation with Latin America and the Caribbean and the rest of the world. I have no mention Africa. Cuba has no military troops in Africa, but Cuba has a lot of civilian cooperation workers that are in most African countries. Cuban ties with the world is the opposite of isolation today.
Carlos Alzugaray, the Trump administration not only undid what the Obama administration tried to do in Cuba, it also imposed further sanctions, something like 240 further sanctions on Cuba. What impact are those sanctions having on day-to-day life in Cuba right now?
The impact was terrible because under Obama, because Obama had issued some licenses that allowed for especially travel, cruise lines, etc., but also a number of, for example, there was a general license for buying medication. So under Obama, there were a lot of benefits that were received. Benefits that, by the way, are normal. This is the normal way that countries carry out their business. So Trump reversed all that, and especially in 2019, he adopted a number of measures. One of them, of course, was putting Cuba back into the terrorism list, which implies more sanctions. But for example, Trump created a list of hotels in which Americans could not stay. This is an addition to the fact that tourism to Cuba is not allowed. Even if you come to Cuba with a license which allows you to come to Cuba, you cannot stay in hotels. You have to go to private businesses. But the number of sanctions was really very strong. For example, one group of sanctions had to do with the supply of oil. Even specific ships were sanctioned. Specific companies, naval companies, marine transport companies were sanctioned. So everything became more and more difficult, and that had a great impact in the economy by making very difficult for Cuba to acquire products and bring products to Cuba. Even ships were affected. So the situation was really very bad, which was added to the COVID pandemic. Remember, the Trump administration imposed only sanctions between 2017 and 2020, and then in 2019, and then in 2020, the COVID began, and it was more difficult because the country came to a stop, and it was very difficult to get out of that. Still very difficult,
right,
to getting out of that crisis.
Yves Engler, do you see any kind of scenario where the United States will be able to establish some kind of a relationship with Cuba, or is it an all or nothing scenario where the United States will want to see the entire Cuban government overthrown, a new system in place before it will establish any kind of relationship? Because a lot of what the United States does right now and says right now appears to be very illogical. It complains about the fact that Cuba is improving its relationship with Russia, with China, but at the same time it does nothing to open up to Cuba.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that if the U.S. concern was relations with Russia or China, it would be, Cuba, anyone look at a map knows that it would make more sense for Cuba to have more economic relationships with the U.S., which would likely displace some of the economic relationships with Russia and China. But that's what goes back to the broader question of why the U.S. is so aggressive towards Cuba. I agree that we obviously saw it under Obama, that you can have a situation where there's a reduction in the sanctions and there's somewhat of an opening up. But even under Obama, there was still policies that tried to isolate Cuba. If you look here in Canada, where I am, the Canadian government is, never formally broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba, but it still treats Cuba in a much harsher way than it does, right-wing ally in Peru, where a government was recently overthrown and the state killed 50+ people, and the Canadian government doesn't say anything about that. But when there's protests in Cuba, they condemn, state repression, even when there's nothing in the vicinity of the state repression that we see in Peru by a unelected U.S. Canadian-backed sort of coup government. But so back to the broader question, can the U.S., I think that you have to understand U.S. policy in the hemisphere to answer that question. And the U.S. has repeatedly tried to overthrow and overthrown governments that pursue social transformation, that break away from the class structure where a small handful of families, run things. And it has also tried to punish governments that try to adopt more independent-minded foreign policies. So can the U.S. Internal structure change? Can the U.S. empire be reined in by a combination of the American people and global forces? Yes, of course it can be. Multipolarity and the rise of Chinese economic power, is one factor that weakens the U.S.'s ability to assert itself all around the world, including in Cuba. But I don't see, so long as there's the basic current structure in Cuba, I don't see the American government fundamentally shifting policy.
Philip, if we look at the Cuban system over the last 70 years, it hasn't been a static system. Just in 2020, from 2020, Cuba began relying more on the private sector to meet its basic needs. And we now have something like 8,000 small and medium-sized businesses, private businesses, that have registered since 2021. So how have circumstances in the country, in the world, changed the socialist landscape of Cuba?
Well, in fact, as Rafael Hernandez said, there are important changes, starting with the 2019 Constitution, which made the private sector or non-state sector an essential element of the Cuban economy. And so it's a question now of how to work out a balance. The government will still control the major means of production, but there has to be a way in which small businesses, medium-sized businesses, can have the independence to do what they want. For example, to be able to import by themselves from foreign companies. Now, there's some effort to allow them to do this, but the problem is that Cuba lacks hard currency. And they lack hard currency because they can't export enough. And so there's a vicious circle where, for example, Cuba could produce its own electricity in a sustainable way. But in order to do that, it needs to have more sugar to use as the residuals for producing electricity. But this year, it had a shortfall in the amount of sugar it produced. This used to be an island that was sugar king, and yet it can't produce enough sugar even to feed its own people, let alone to have a residual for sustainable energy. And so the problem is providing incentives for small and medium-sized businesses without there being so much inequality that it destroys the fundamental values of the revolution.
And that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.